This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for May 1st, 2022. It has been over 2 months now. As always, let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com, and it is pro-Ukraine, pro-US, pro-NATO. So always keep that in mind when you're looking at this. And again, it's always important to check the major fronts. Kherson, this is a city held by Russia. They are advancing towards Nikolaev, and beyond that is Odessa, and then beyond that is Transnistria, where there are Russian peacekeepers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It comes up in the Pentagon briefing. Then if you move eastward, here is Mariupol. You'll hear various sources claim Mariupol is still being contested, but even this pro-Ukrainian map admits that the remaining Ukrainian forces are confined to the Azovstal steelworks. It's an industrial complex, and that is it. That is where they are trapped underground, running out of food, water, and ammunition, and being shelled and bombed daily. Apparently, there are civilians trapped in there, and they are not allowed to leave because the Azov battalion, these Nazis who are officially part of Ukraine's armed forces, they refuse to let them out. And they are demanding that both the civilians and they themselves be allowed to leave Mariupol and return to either Ukrainian-held territory or to another country entirely. This is a group of individuals who refuse to be held accountable for what they have done. They are not fighting on out of any sense of bravery. They are stubborn because they believe there is still a way to save their skins and avoid captivity by the Russians. And then if we continue all the way east to the Donbas region, you can see this encirclement taking shape around Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, these two very essential cities or towns, if you will. Once Russia gets this area, I mean, the encirclement will be well on its way to be completed. And all of the Ukrainian forces in here, who have been tormenting Donetsk and Luhansk, the People's Republics, for 8 years now, they will be encircled. They will not be able to escape, and it'll just be a matter of time before they are either destroyed or captured. And that is what the battlefield looks like. There's also, all the way to the north, I think is worth mentioning, Kharkiv. Kharkiv is this city here, and you see the Russian presence right outside the outskirts of the city. And we'll also talk about Kharkiv because it is a pro-Russian city. And then you would wonder, why is there this fierce resistance? Well, because Ukraine sent their most fanatic fighters to Kharkiv to not only fight Russia, but also suppress its residents. And we will talk about that. We will talk about how the Western media itself has admitted this, essentially. So what I always do is I go through a variety of sources, and I like to go to the US Department of Defense's website. I look through their transcripts and their briefings on Ukraine specifically. So there will be 2 of those, and I will look at a Russian statement from TASS, which is Russian state media, and I will bring in additional information as necessary to make it clear what is being talked about, to give a little bit more context. So let's start with Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby holds a press briefing. This was from April 29th, 2022. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you will notice that there is a video, so you can watch it and listen to it rather than read through all of this. And this briefing is a doozy. This is a real doozy. It's the Pentagon, or at least their spokesperson, losing their cool, really. And I'll get to that toward the end, but let's just do the overview. So John Kirby is talking about the US training Ukrainians, and for the first time, they admit which country, at least one of the countries that it's happening in, which is Germany. And they're doing it with Germany's cooperation. They do not disclose the other, at least 2 other countries. And they also said that there's a possibility of doing it in additional countries down the road. And this is still the artillery and counter-battery radar training. And they're training them 50 at a time. And they're sending them back to Ukraine to then train other Ukrainians. They're getting 6 days of training. That is not enough. Even if you have a background in artillery, that is not enough to learn the system, be confident on it, enough to teach someone else to be effective on it. And it certainly is not enough time to teach about actual maintenance. You can do an overview, but you're not going to give them the training and the practice that they need to do this in the field where, the chaotic situation on a battlefield, there's no way they're going to be able to use these effectively. There are 90 in total, and 90 when you've lost over 1,000, which is the reason they need American artillery instead of more artillery that they're used to, because they run out, is because it's gone. Russia has destroyed it. So 90 more that you're not even all that familiar with or experienced on is just going to be more equipment lost on the battlefield, and possibly the crews along with it. John Kirby's talking about helping the Ukrainians win their battles today, and more specifically in eastern Ukraine, where the main battle is taking place, and to build strength for tomorrow. So this is a short-term, but also long-term goal that the U.S. Department of Defense is pursuing here, trying to, basically, it's the continuation of the militarization and the NATOization of Ukraine. All of their Soviet-era weaponry and the indigenous equipment based on Soviet designs that they had, all of that is destroyed in this war, and it's being replaced by U.S. weapons, British weapon systems from Germany, the Western military-industrial complex. That is what is happening with Ukraine, and all it is going to do is perpetuate the threat Ukraine represents to Russia, which is only in turn going to solidify Russia's determination to solve this problem. And as Kirby is talking about this winning the battles today and building strength tomorrow, he's talking about why Ukraine's military is as capable as it is today. And he's talking about the last 8 years of training. But what he's admitting is how much time it takes to actually train a capable military. And if that military enters into a war where it is taking heavy losses, and that trained and experienced manpower is being lost on the battlefield, you cannot replace that by just shipping weapons into the country. It's going to take years of training to replace those human resources. He's talking about 8 years of training, developing command and control, battlefield initiative through a competent non-commissioned officer corps, NCOs. You cannot replace that. You cannot ship more of those over to Ukraine. That takes years of training and experience. Ukraine doesn't have years. So when that is lost, it is gone. And then the amount of money and weapons and training that you try to assist your proxies with in the middle of a war will never be enough. This is the exact same situation the US proxies in Syria faced. They had the same problem. You had an endless torrent of money and weapons and training going on the border, but you're standing up these armies. They have limited experience, limited leadership, limited experience coordinating themselves on the battlefield, and you're just sending them in against an experienced and increasingly battle-hardened army, the Syrian Arab army and their allies, which includes Russia. They were just no match, and there was no way they were ever going to win. And the same situation is starting to take shape in Ukraine. And this is, if you listen carefully and you read between the lines, this is what even the Pentagon is admitting, even if they don't say it directly. Then, of course, in these briefings, there's always question and answers. Actually, it is mostly questions and answers. And so some of the questions from the Western media were about actually a variety of things. One was asking about this former U.S. Marine killed in Ukraine, and he was apparently hired by a private military contractor. And they were asking, what can you tell us about this private military contractor? Are they working together with the US government? And he says not to his knowledge, which is not a convincing and definitive no. Someone out there is paying for this. This is not something that you make money doing. You don't make money by paying people to go to Ukraine and die unless someone is paying you to do that. So there is a government somewhere paying this military contractor to find mercenaries to send to Ukraine. Who's doing that? We don't know yet. There's no evidence. John Kirby says it's not the U.S. Department of Defense. And throughout the presentation and as he's answering questions, he's bragging about how quickly they're getting these weapons to Ukraine. But again, you can move material items around quickly into Ukraine. Can you get it quickly from Western Ukraine to the front? That's another question. Can you do it safely without it getting destroyed on the way? And then do you have the experienced manpower to efficiently and effectively use it in combat? And the answer is increasingly no. And this is something that the Pentagon has no answer to. It is a matter of time that they simply don't have. There was a question about Moldova, so let's talk a little bit about Moldova. There was a question about Moldova, and the question was asked in a way that suggested that it was Russia terrorizing Transnistria, which is actually a pro-Russian breakaway region within Moldova, with Russian peacekeepers stationed there. So they're suggesting that Russia is deliberately attacking their own a territory that is friendly with them to somehow justify expanding the conflict into Transnistria and Moldova. And John Kirby uses Moldova interchangeably with Transnistria. As a matter of fact, doesn't really mention Transnistria. So what he's saying is that if Russia does anything in regards to Transnistria, from his point of view, it is something being done to Moldova. And the problem here is, as I pointed out in my last update, is that Russian forces are nowhere near Transnistria. They still have to take Nikolaev and Odessa, and then they will be ready to do something, if anything, with Transnistria, and right now they're not, which is precisely why it is most likely Ukraine or their NATO allies starting up trouble in Transnistria, doing it now before Russia is in a position to do anything about it, to either stop it or to capitalize from the chaos that they're creating. There were also questions about stories of U.S. Special Forces on the ground in Ukraine training forces. We've heard about UK Special Forces in Ukraine training them. This was what going on all throughout the conflict in Syria. It was often denied, and then later it would come out as confirmed that yes, that was going on. And John Kirby denies it, but it's almost certainly going on. But the question is, does it make any difference? They were doing this in Syria, and it made no difference to the outcome of that conflict. John Kirby continuously, in every briefing he gives, continuously repeats these myths about this conflict. It's a 2-month-long conflict, and there's already myths that are being repeated and cemented into the minds of people who still, take seriously what the Pentagon is saying at face value, at least. And he's talking about how Russia tried as hard as they could to take Kiev, and they couldn't, and they lost that battle. And I remind people over and over again that if you want to take a city, you have to have a 3 to 4 to 1 advantage. So you have to have either 3 or 4 attackers for every 1 defender in the city. And we know that Russia understands that, because that is what they did in Mariupol to take that city, which they now have under their control. They did not do that in regards to Kiev. They were outside the city with a 1-to-1 or maybe a 1.3 to 1 advantage attacker to defender. That is nowhere near enough to even encircle the city, let alone take it. And so Russia was never seriously trying to take Kiev in any sort of conventional way. It was a fixing operation that tied up thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Ukrainian forces, while Russian forces elsewhere in the country achieved their objectives, including taking Kherson, Mariupol, and encircling Ukrainian forces in the Donbas region. I talked about in my last update about Russia warning the West about the possibility of nuclear war if everything continues to escalate. And everyone, including John Kirby in this briefing, continues to claim that this is bluster. And they try to minimize Russia's national security concerns. They act as if Russia is carrying out a war of aggression rather than a conflict that is of existential significance to them. And it's obvious if you study history why Russia is doing what it's doing. What led up to this? The expansion of NATO up to Russia's border. And when you say a nation joined NATO, it's not because they decided they wanted to join NATO. It's because the US and NATO overthrew that government and put in a client regime that chose to join NATO. That is what they have been doing to nation after nation after nation. This is exactly what they did to Ukraine in 2014. Not only that, but the US and its allies have sponsored conflict within Russia's borders. There were 2 wars in Chechnya sponsored by the US. That was tens of thousands dead. That was a huge risk to Russia of losing its own territory. And then you have to think about wars like the invasion of Iraq, or the destruction of Libya, or the ongoing proxy war in Syria. These are all Soviet and then Russian Federation allies that the US, one after another, took off the list. This is what they were doing in the lead up to what is going on now in Ukraine. They also in 2008 armed, equipped, backed, and encouraged Georgia to attack Russia. And people will say, no, didn't Russia attack Georgia? No. Even the EU commissioned a report that found that it was Georgia who initiated those hostilities. And then they were doing the exact same thing, but only on a much more massive scale in Ukraine, right on Russia's border. And in addition to just creating a potential threat, every single year since 2014, they've been threatening to take Crimea back by force. And all during that time, they were shelling and killing ethnic Russians right on Russia's doorstep. So it was a clear and present danger. This is what Russia was reacting to. And people like John Kirby are trying to minimize that or ignore that entirely and act as if Russia just woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine. This $33 billion that we keep hearing about, this is marked for the next 5 months of fighting. That is what John Kirby said, but he said that is not the end of it. This funding will, for all intents and purposes, be renewed indefinitely. There was a question about how the US can help degrade Russian military power, and John Kirby admits that the US wants to see Russia weakened, and he claims that yes, Russia is weaker now than when it started the war. But I guess you could argue the US was weaker a month into or 2 months into the war in Iraq than it was before it went in, but this can be regenerated. But then he admits that that's what the sanctions are for. The sanctions are an attempt to prevent Russia from quickly regenerating whatever it's losing in this conflict. Now he's talking about the heavy losses that Russia is suffering, but in another briefing that I'm going to go over here, they're going to talk about how Russia supposedly took these heavy losses, especially around Kiev and other areas in the north of Ukraine. They withdrew those forces and they sent them to Donbas very, very quickly. And by their estimate, too quickly to have fully re-equipped them, yet they're there and they're fighting and they're making gains on the ground. How is that possible? It's possible if the heavy losses the US and others claimed Russia suffered weren't as heavy as they said. They may not be as few as Russia has claimed, but they are definitely not as heavy as the US has claimed, because it's very clear, just look on the ground. If it was true, there would be a huge operational slowdown, and there hasn't been. And then John Kirby starts getting really weird. But before we get into that, let's talk about this consultative meeting. There were 40 nations that attended this consultative meeting on Ukraine at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. 40 countries. Wow, that sounds like a lot of countries, doesn't it? But remember, the Friends of Syria meeting, the first one in 2012, had 114 states. 114 states. That's a lot of states. They all came together to support the Syrian opposition in the attempted overthrow of the Syrian government. And of course, that failed. It was also increasingly obvious that this pro-democracy opposition were actually just extremists, terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these sort of people. By the next year, these Friends of Syria meetings, the number of attendees significantly dropped. By how much? By almost 10 times as much. It's 11 main foreign supporters in Istanbul, Turkey. That is how quickly that consultative group shrank. And now the very first consultative meeting in regards to Ukraine has only 40 nations attending. Do you think that number is going to grow or shrink over time? I think it's going to shrink. And then John Kirby starts getting really weird, really emotional, flustered, frustrated. He starts talking about Putin and his bizarre messaging and ridiculous claims about Nazis and about the justification Russia is trying to use and the methods he claims Russia is using to fight in this conflict. And then he says this clip. As a matter of fact, I'm going to just play the clip.
Putting aside whether you agree with his logic, do you believe that Putin is a rational actor?
I'm not a psychologist. Barely got a history degree from the University of South Florida. I'm not going to go into the psychology of Vladimir Putin. It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that. It's difficult to look at the It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that. So I can't talk to his psychology, but I think we can all speak to his depravity.
Now, I'm just wondering where John Kirby's tears were when the U.S. was in Iraq or Afghanistan for 20 years. In Iraq, based on a lie, killing 1 million people, displacing tens of millions of people, creating a cascade effect across the entire region, instability across the entire region, killing tens or hundreds of thousands more. The U.S. maintaining torture dungeons in these countries, Abu Ghraib, for example. This is what we know the U.S. did. We don't see any evidence from him or anyone else in the U.S. government about what they're claiming Russia is doing. At one point, he's talking about Russia tying civilians' hands behind their backs and putting bullets in their head. We have seen evidence of people doing that in Ukraine. But who was it? Who was doing that? It was Ukraine. Let's look at this Business Insider article. Video appears to show Ukrainian soldiers executing Russian soldier captured in an ambush outside Kiev, New York Times reports. And this was reported at the beginning of April, but this was actually March 30th. This was just a few miles away from Bucha, northwest of Kiev, where that supposed massacre took place, which they're blaming on the Russians. This is video evidence of Ukrainians killing people in the exact same manner they claimed the victims in Bucha were killed. So let's read this. The video, the Times reported, also shows at least 3 other Russian soldiers dead near the victim, identified by white armbands commonly worn by Russian troops. One of the soldiers has an obvious head wound, and his hands are tied behind his back, according to the report from the Times. So John Kirby is shedding these crocodile tears, accusing Russia of tying people's hands behind their back and executing them, when the only people on video actually doing that are the Ukrainians. There's no actual evidence of Russia doing any of these things that John Kirby and others are accusing Russia of. He's talking about Nazism. That it's bizarre messaging. It's a ridiculous claim. And I have pointed out before, and I'm going to do it again, that the Western media itself has reported extensively on a growing and very serious Nazi problem inside of Ukraine. So let's just go, let's run the gambit. This is from the BBC, 2014. Neo-Nazi threat in New Ukraine, NEWSNIGHT. Ukraine conflict, white power warrior from Sweden, 2014. Right here, Ukraine underplays role of far right in conflict, and now the US is underplaying far right. And when they say far right, they mean Nazis. And you know they're Nazis because you see Nazis waving a Nazi flag. That's how you know they're Nazis. And if you're going to dispute this symbol, just hold on. Just hold on a second. So this is from 2015, the far-right group threatening to overthrow Ukraine's government, NEWSNIGHT, because we hear all the time about how, oh, okay, there might be some Nazis in Ukraine, but they have no power. Well, the BBC in 2015 was saying they have so much power that they're actually threatening to overthrow the Ukrainian government if they don't do what they say. And this is a BBC reporter in Ukraine, and he's saying that's a Nazi symbol, isn't it? That's a wolf's angle, and that is the same symbol as this. That Azov battalion flies. That is a Nazi symbol. And if you look at that flag closely, you'll see the black sun, which is also a Nazi symbol. Here, 2018, Ukraine on patrol with the far-right national militia, BBC NEWSNIGHT. And this is just a still from the video, the Nazi wolf's angle and the black sun behind it. And then more recently from 2017, this is from The Hill. This isn't RT, this is The Hill. The reality of neo-Nazis in Ukraine is far from Kremlin propaganda. And here is from this year, March 2022 profile. Who are Ukraine's far-right Azov regiment? Oh, this is a regiment because they kept saying battalion. Battalion is very small. Regiment is larger. And because they kept saying that it's a very tiny number, it's like only 300 guys, when it's not. It's thousands and thousands just for Azov alone. It says the far-right neo-Nazi group has expanded to become part of Ukraine's armed forces, a street militia, and a political party. So if Russian President Vladimir Putin thought that Ukraine had a Nazi problem, maybe it was because he was reading the Western media for the last 8 years, because the Western media has been saying Ukraine has a serious and growing Nazi problem. And so you have the Pentagon trying to depict the Russians as being irrational, as being dishonest, trying to deny them their justification for acting in Ukraine, when in reality there is a serious Nazi problem. And if John Kirby is lying about that, you have to ask yourself what else he's lying about. That's the problem with lying. Nobody knows where you're drawing the line. And then at the very, very end, I mean, the way this whole briefing ended was people in the audience asking John Kirby, are we witnessing a genocide? What about Putin's state of mind? How could anyone do this? They're acting as if in recent memory, they have never witnessed a war take place at all, ever. They're acting like this is the first time it's happened that they're aware of. It's a whole room of adults acting like this. It's a reflection of where the US is politically, psychologically. It's very troubling. It's very troubling. Now there's this briefing. A lot of it is repetitive, so I'm not going to go over things that John Kirby covered in his. This is senior defense official holds background briefing, also April 29th, 2022. I'm going to just go over the main points. He says, talking about the Donbas region, he says, in the Donbas area, again, still fighting over in various different locations. We believe that essentially what they're doing is continuing to set conditions for a sustained and larger and longer offensive. That I am not suggesting that the offensive hasn't begun. Of course, they've begun. There is fighting there, but we still think that it is a piece of their trying to set the proper conditions for sustained offensive operations. So they're saying, however big you think it is now, they think that it'll just continue to intensify. And I agree with them. And it's in this briefing that the senior defense official admits that Russia pulled those forces out from around Kiev and Chernigov, and they sent them to Belarus. They sent them to the east of Ukraine, Donbas, the Donbas region, and they spent very little time reinforcing them, re-equipping them. And you have to ask yourself, how is that possible? How could they do that so quickly and send them back into battle where they're making these gains now in the east if they suffered the losses that the Western media suggests they did? They also talk about these M113s. These are tracked armored transports. They're very old. The US was using them back in Vietnam, for example. And I think the Marine Corps still had some during Desert Storm. I don't know about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but the US doesn't really use them all. These are old, aging pieces of equipment that they are sending to Ukraine, and they said they are training Ukrainians to use them. It's a 5-day thing. You've got about 3 days that are dedicated to maintaining that piece of gear and 2 days dedicated to learning how to drive it. That is not enough time to employ these effectively. It's enough to drive them around until the first time it breaks down, and that's it, and it's out. And tracked vehicles have a tendency to break down. They require a lot of back end to keep them going, support to keep them going, that Ukraine simply doesn't have. And one thing I want to point out is that all of these countries are sending Ukraine all types of different systems. None of them are interoperable. In other words, when the transmission goes on an M113, you can't use the transmission from another one of these vehicles that they've sent. It's not interchangeable. A lot of modern militaries, when they're designing a new series of armed vehicles, they will use the same chassis for a whole number of purposes, so that they have that interoperability and that interchangeability, the ability to fill a warehouse with just one set of spare parts that can be used for all of these across the board. It simplifies logistics, and whoever has the best logistics is going to win. And right now, it is obviously, clearly Russia, who has advantages head and shoulders above Ukraine. And there's nothing to suggest that that will change at all, no matter how long this conflict goes. We kept hearing about the Phoenix Ghost drones. We're not even really sure what exactly they do. It's supposedly a new version of the Switchblade, a suicide drone, basically, that is also capable of reconnaissance before it dives down to take out a target. The Pentagon is saying that the training for these drones hasn't even started, and at most they're going to get 121 because it was just being developed. I guess it hasn't gone into mass production yet, and so they're only going to get 121 of these. And I don't think that Russia has 121 of anything on the battlefield, that if Ukraine was able to take it out, that would end the war or even turn the tide. A question was asked of the senior defense official about the prospect of giving Ukraine US air defense systems. I've talked about this in my last update. Russia has the best air defense systems on Earth. The US has no systems that are even comparable to most of what Russia has. They have a layered defense system. They have multiple systems that link together, track targets together, use the appropriate system to take out the type of target that is detected. The US does not really have this capability. So even if they sent Patriots or whatever, they don't compare to Russian air defense, and they will not perform as well as Russian air defense. And by the way, sending them Patriot systems, any sophisticated air defense system like this, will take months and months of training just to learn how to operate it, and then months more to learn how to use it effectively, months and months to repair it, and if not, it has to be sent out of the country to get repaired by maybe private contractors, either far in the rear or in another country, and then be sent back. It is entirely impractical, which is why the Pentagon says there's no active discussion about giving Ukraine US air defense systems, because it's just too far-fetched. Now I want to get into this report that I saw on TASS, which is Russian state media. It's right here. Territorial defense militants torture pro-Russian residents of Nikolaev top brass. Ukraine's territorial defense fighters capture people in punitive raids in Nikolaev and torture them for pro-Russian views. That is what Russian state media is saying. Is that Russian propaganda? It could be. How could we know? Well, we could look for reports from the West to see if there's anything similar. A member of my audience actually sent me this video. I'm very lucky that I saw this, and I was able to cross-reference it with this TASS report. Check out this report from AP. Ukraine hunts down traitors helping Russia. And I'm going to let it play here because they say some things on the screen, but I'm going to narrate a little bit of this. It says, working with Russian forces or publicly denying the invasion can result in stiff prison sentences. So working with Russian forces, I can kind of understand that if you had national security laws and you were caught collaborating with the enemy, that could be illegal. But denying the invasion, this is a more of a political view. This is someone just speaking their mind, their opinion. And this is Ukraine having laws that allow them to have armed men storm their house and drag them out of their house, arrest them, and put them in prison. That sounds problematic from a Western point of view, who says across the board that everywhere else that would be free speech, but right now in Ukraine that is okay. And notice this AP video, they're filming these armed Ukrainian security forces dragging this guy out of his home and taking him away to God knows where to have God knows what done to him. These Ukrainian security forces are being professional because they're on camera. We don't know. We can only imagine how they act when there's no camera there. And the link to this will be in the video description below. And you go watch it and you tell me if you think that is how those security forces normally act when there's no camera around. Let me read a little bit more from this AP video, and I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this. This is in Kharkiv. This is the city in northeast Ukraine that Russian forces are right at the outskirts of. This man that we just saw getting dragged out of his home, he's being dragged out of his home for praising the Russian president, calling for succession, and insulting the Ukrainian flag. That is what armed men are dragging him out of his home and throwing him into a prison cell for. That's what they're doing. And AP admits that 400 have been arrested in Kharkiv alone, in this city alone, for these type of infractions. And you see the security asking this man, you supported Putin? Are you supporting the Russian army? You're not speaking very nicely about the Ukrainian flag, are you? And then they show some stills of the messages that he had there in Russian. It says, to split from Ukraine is not separatism, it's evacuation. And then what he said about the Ukrainian flag, he says, this rag is a symbol of death. And all throughout the AP piece, there's no narration. There's the security forces and everyone speaking in the video, and there's subtitles, but it's like they put the text over the video. And they keep talking about collaborators, and they even have Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky talking about how they're going to get collaborators. And it appears that AP is suggesting that up to the president knows this is going on, condones it, and regularly talks about this process of rounding up people like this man we saw yanked out of his house for speaking his mind. He was not collaborating with Russia. He was simply speaking his mind. And in Kharkiv, a city that is pro-Russian, this is what's been going on for 8 years. This isn't just because the war started. And I'm going to prove that to you here in a moment. But then they cut to an elderly man who again, armed men are storming into his house, and they're looking for information about his son, who they said they caught taking video of artillery strikes around Kharkiv. They said they checked his phone and he had contact with the enemy, but they never really explained that. And the elderly man says, who is he taking a video of shelling us? It was you, the Ukrainians, the fascists. This is the sentiment that is in Kharkiv, and you don't hear about it much because you have this atmosphere of fear and terror, because this is what they've been doing for 8 years, snatching people out of their homes for political speech. Now, I've talked about this before. This is from NPR. This is from January this year, right before these operations began. It says, the view from border city Kharkiv, they're calling it Kharkiv, I call it Kharkiv, Ukraine, as Russian troops appear ready to invade. And what do they say? They say, you know, I came here expecting to find pro-Russian sentiment in the East, and I haven't seen that at all. To the contrary, there are Ukrainian flags everywhere, and in front of the town hall and the Christmas market, there's a big exhibit about Russian aggression. There's like pictures showing Putin with a Hitler mustache and signs talking about boycotting Russian products. And people here even tell me that they're making an effort to speak Ukrainian, whereas before everyone mostly spoke Russian. I wonder why they don't want to speak Russian, because they know if they do, these guys are going to come and yank them out of their house and throw them in a dungeon cell at best and kill them, most likely. Torture and kill them, most likely. Because that is what Ukraine has been doing to the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine for the last 8 years. We know that they sent their most fanatic fighters to the most pro-Russian cities, still under their control, to threaten, terrorize, and silence the pro-Russian people. This is an article from Financial Times right here. Don't confuse patriotism and Nazism. Ukraine's Azov forces face scrutiny. And again, these are Nazis. They admit that having started as a militia of just over 300 troops, there are now scores of thousands of Azov fighters, said Belinsky. He is the co-founder of the Social National Assembly, a grouping of the most extreme nationalist Ukrainian political parties. He's also the founder of Azov. Most of the Azov battalion are fighting within Ukraine's territorial defense units, including more than 1,000 in Kharkiv, he said. The interior minister did not comment on the figures, and it was always obvious that there were a growing number of not just Azov Nazis, but Nazis in general, from Right Sector, Aidar, from all of these groups. They started out in the hundreds. In a year or two after the takeover in 2014, there were thousands. There's probably, when this all began, well over 10,000. Well over 10,000. Perhaps over 10,000 of Azov alone. And this is what was going on in these pro-Russian cities. You had these Nazis dragging people away. And if they were Russian-speaking, they would make an effort to speak Ukrainian because they didn't want to be dragged away. It had nothing to do with thinking Kiev represented their best interests better than Russia. And now that Russians are at the gates of Kharkov, you see these people, even that elderly man, go watch that video, even that elderly man is speaking out against Ukraine because they can sense that the end is near and that the Russians are going to come and liberate them. They feel they're being liberated because for the last 8 years, they feel like they've been occupied. This is what Russia has been trying to say for the last 8 years. And AP, in their video, shows you on video Ukrainian security forces terrorizing people over political speech. Now, this all circles back to John Kirby and him claiming that Putin and his ridiculous claims, his bizarre messaging about Nazis and about how he has to save the Russian people from the Ukrainian regime. AP showed you a video of it. AP showed you a video of it. If President Vladimir Putin thinks Russian-speaking people in Ukraine are in danger, maybe it's because he's watching AP. Maybe that's where he's getting his bizarre messaging and his ridiculous claims from. Just to wrap this up, I just want to say people still tried to argue, why did Russia go in? Military operations are very extreme. It's an extreme way to solve a problem. Why didn't they try more diplomacy? Because when Russia came to the table, the people on the other side of the table talked like this. They dismissed the claims of Nazis as ridiculous, knowing full well that they were Nazis, knowing full well that they were helping perpetuate and expand the problem of Nazism in Ukraine. They knew the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine were being treated badly, if not facing genocide. They knew all of this. They dismissed Russia's concerns. They dismissed their national security concerns of a country on their border being militarized by NATO, threatening to take back Crimea every year, their military capacity building up, and not just that, killing ethnic Russians on their doorstep by the thousands for the last 8 years. And the people on the other side of the table are telling Russia that's not what's happening. And now you can see why Russia decided to do what they did. Because there was no reasoning with those people on the other side of the table. People like John Kirby with his fake tears, imagining that Russian President Vladimir Putin must be insane to think that there's Nazis or that the Russian-speaking people are in danger, when AP is showing videos of Ukrainian security services storming people's homes and literally dragging them away because of their political views. That you can't do diplomacy with people like that, who are either that deliberately dishonest or who are that delusional. It's impossible. And this is why military force, the last resort, became the only resort. That's why Russia is in Ukraine right now. And if you look carefully and you ignore the propaganda and you ignore John Kirby's crocodile tears, you can see the truth. You can see the facts. Without ever looking at Russian state media, you can see it everywhere you look in the Western media, if you just know how to look. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find my work in case YouTube deletes my channel. I'm on Odyssey. I'm on Rumble. I'm also on Telegram. All of the articles that I just referenced and videos, they're all in the video description below. Just check it out. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, through PayPal. It is because of my audience's generosity that I am able to do these videos and continue doing these. Thank you so much, everyone who has contributed. Thank you so much. And even if you're just sharing my work with others or sending news tips or sending kind words, I greatly appreciate that as well. Thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.